It's really a privilege and a blessing to be able to travel to France after more than 18 months of being confined to the small island city-state of Singapore, and where most of the interactions have been over Zoom, endless meetings over Zoom, and seeing people not in their fullness, but as flat images on the screen. So today I would like to speak on the topic of transient migrant workers and the spatial politics of non-integration in the global city, and I'll be using Singapore as the case example. Transient migrant workers include both migrant construction workers that are usually all male, as well as migrant domestic workers, and this is a group that's usually all female. So this also provides us an opportunity to look at the gender politics of space as well. But let me start by, in a sense, reflecting a little bit about traditional migration research that tends to focus on permanent forms of migration with the eventual goal of settlement in host country. That is the staple of migration research in the West in particular, where the concerns are usually with assimilation, acculturation, and integration of new immigrants who are coming to settle, and of course, interest in subsequent generations of immigrants. So this kind of work in geography has more or less focused on what we call migrant residential concentrations, sometimes known as ethnic enclaves in Western cities. So very famous enclaves like Vancouver's Chinatown or St. Francisco's Chinatown or Koreatown in New York, Little Italy's in many different cities and so forth. So this sort of work, of course, has a lot of value, but is unable to fully explain the diversity of migration today, because this permanent migration does not take into account the multiplicity of different kinds of migratory moves that includes more temporary, more multi-directional forms of migrations that we see today. Good, it's moving. So I want to focus on the temporary migration regime in Asia today, where we see global cities drawing on large pools of low-wage transient migrants, usually to perform 3D work that's difficult, that's dangerous, that's demeaning in some ways, and work that's often shunned by the citizens themselves. So it falls on migrant workers to carry the burden of this sort of work in construction, in marine sector, and in domestic work. I want to focus on the temporary migration regime in Asia today, where we see global cities drawing on large pools of low-wage transient migrants, usually to perform 3D work that's difficult, that's dangerous, that's demeaning in some ways, and work that's often shunned by the citizens themselves. So it falls on migrant workers to carry the burden of this sort of work in construction, in marine sector, and in domestic work. Often the migrants are under a form of management that's based on, as in the words of Ram Hugo, constraint, policing, and exclusion. Withers and Piper, in a forthcoming chapter in the Handbook of Transnationalism that I have the joy of editing, I think says it best. They phrase it this way, that under temporary migration, migrant lives are conducted under conditions where settlement is unattainable. So this is not a form of migration and settlement. Settlement is usually out of reach. Family accompaniment is impossible. These migrate alone without their families, without their partners and their children and the larger family. And of course, for low-wage migrants, return visits are also financially impracticable. So usually during the contract period of a year or 2 years, returning home is something that's very expensive and impracticable to achieve. What I want to focus on is the outcome of this form of temporary migration regime that, in a sense, gives rise to a spatial politics in cities. And I call this a spatial politics not of integration, but of non-integration. because it's a form of enforced transience. So in the face of ongoing discrimination, racism and xenophobia against migrants, and this of course have gotten worse with the pandemic, migration scholarship, I feel, needs to look afresh at the politics of space in understanding migrant-host encounters. So migrant spatial concentrations no longer take the form of these residential enclaves that we see in largely Western cities. In fact, migrant concentrations now operate under very different conditions under temporary migration regimes. These spatial formations are associated with the ephemeral hold of transient migrants on the city's public spaces. These temporary migrants do not have a sense of wanting to settle or not being able to settle. So their hold on public spaces tends to be transient, fleeting, and ephemeral. And to help us with this process, I want to, in a sense, build the talk around two conceptual ideas, the processes of enclavization and enclosure in looking at the ensuing spatial politics. The first, enclavization, to signal the active spatial temporal process where transient migrant populations stake temporary claims on the city's public spaces to facilitate migrant sociality and networking. So this kind of spatial formations are often seen to be based on migrants' strategic choice. They choose to come together in migrant sociality for networking purposes, to, in a sense, meet each other as often co-ethnics or co-nationals. But it must be understood that these kinds of spatial formations is not just about strategic choice, but they're also constrained by host society's exclusionary politics. And in the literature, these are often called weekend enclaves because they are not residential in nature. They pop up during the weekend and then sort of melt away during the work week when the migrants return to their workspaces. So the second concept that I want to use today is the concept of enclosure. Enclosure is about the construction of borders, and these borders can be material borders, can be bodily borders, and often they are symbolic borders as well. And these borders mark the separation and containment of the migrant other, and takes the form of examples of the dormitory complexes that we'll talk about today, gated communities and confinement camps. Enclosure, therefore, offers not just a material buffer, but a psychological buffer between who's considered inside and who's considered outside. And this kind of technique of disciplining sort of migrant bodies reinforces understandings of difference. As said in the last quote there, which I thought was quite useful to put up to understand, this kind of enclosure technique allows migrants to be constantly governed at distance through their everyday lives and through governing their effective relations in reproducing conditions of precarity. So turning to the case of Singapore, just to give a little bit of background, Singapore is a globalizing city-state. We have about 5.7 million people, of which more than 1 million are low-wage transient workers who live and work in the city. And these include both construction workers and domestic workers that I will focus on today. So Singapore is, you see here in this particular diagram, where the citizens comprise less than 2/3 of the population, and more than 1/3 are people who are non-citizens, of which the low-wage, low-skilled labor in construction, in manual labor, and domestic work make up about 17% of the population. So in numbers, we're talking about over 300,000 construction workers, mainly from South Asia, from Bangladesh and India, as well as other countries like Thailand, Myanmar, and so forth. But the majority would be from Bangladesh and India. A little bit more background on the idea of enforced transience that's applied to these low-wage migrant workers. They are called work permit holders in Singapore. So these migrant work permit holders are placed under constant surveillance. They usually come to Singapore on 1 year or 2 year contracts, which may not be renewed at the end of 1 year or 2 years. It can be renewed, but they may not. And this, in a sense, allows for easy repatriation of the worker. And when they're in Singapore, they are placed under surveillance through medical examinations. And for female domestic workers, they are also subject to pregnancy tests, which is a guard against family formation within whole society. There are also other limits to family formation, where they are not permitted to marry Singaporeans or permanent residents. And they are, of course, also not allowed to bring family members with them. So they migrate as migrant labor, and in a sense, they are welcome in Singapore to labor, but not to stay. So just a step back to, in a sense, reflect a little bit about the study itself that we conducted in pre-COVID times. So this is a study that involves 2 groups of transient labor in Singapore, the female Indonesian domestic workers, as well as male Bangladeshi construction workers. So Indonesian workers are the majority in Singapore in the domestic sector. So we chose to focus our interviews on them. And for the construction workers, we chose to interview the Bangladeshi workers through qualitative interviews and ethnographic study. So the focus of this particular talk is on 2 sets of processes that underpin spatial politics of non-integration. One is the ground-up, ground-driven enclavization, in a sense, driven by the migrants' desire to meet in their weekend enclaves or gathering grounds. These, and in that sense, forming co-national social spaces of support for one another, or you can call them comfort zones of co-ethnic belonging. And on the other hand, a state-driven enclosure processes that confines the foreign domestic workers to home space, and for the male construction workers, it's to do with enclosing them in purpose-built dormitories that are found in the peripheral locations in Singapore, where it is then easier to provide care as well as enforce control. Okay, so I'm going to, in a sense, focus first on the politics of enclosure by looking at the migrant workers' living spaces. And we start with looking at the male construction workers and dormitory spaces. So here we see that the migrant worker dormitories are often set apart from citizen homes and located at peripheral locations. So these sites are, as you can see on the map, at the periphery of the city, of the island, as well as in industrial zones, right? Okay, so, and the spatial distance that is then, in a sense, provided by this kind of location provides a so-called natural barrier to minimize the psychological discomforts of proximity and face-to-face interactions. So these dormitories range in sizes, and here you see an example of a mega dormitory, one of the largest in Singapore. This is called Tuas View Dormitory, and it's an integrated facility, almost like an integrated resort. It has 16,800 beds, but it's not just for, it's not just in a sense bed space, but it also has various features that provide care for the workers, like a mini mart, a beer garden, a food court, recreational options, including a cinema, and because many of them are from South Asia, a cricket field within its compound. So this particular other diagram, photograph shows how it's advertised. Tuas View Dormitory, mega, modern, integrated. And what takes the cake is sea view, because it's located at the periphery, so you can almost see the sea. So it's almost like, in a sense, advertising for a condominium, right? So this is, in a sense, what the migrant construction workers are offered. So I've just put up a few quotes from the interviews that we did, translated, of course. Here, Syed says that when he first came to Singapore, he was living in a container space. We were 6 in the top in the container, and downstairs it was 5 or less. It's actually based on the demand. When more people in the company, then there is a crowd. And then from the container, he was then moved to a twice dormitory, where there is a big room, 35 to 40 in a single room. Yes, 7 toilets, 7 washrooms there, 1 person in every bed. So everyone has their own bed space, but of course, all the other facilities are shared. This kind of logic means that when the demand for workers is high, there will be more of a crowd in each of the rooms. This kind of logic of enclosure also facilitates surveillance. And the form of surveillance that the workers were most concerned about happened not to be about technological surveillance. So we were talking to them, and they were more worried about mutual human surveillance. And Sumon here says that we asked him, why does he sleep on the floor when he has a bed space? And he sleeps at the bottom of the double-decker bed structure, and says that, well, I sleep on the floor because the top bed in the double-decker, where another migrant worker is occupying, moves all the time, and it breaks my sleep in the middle of the night. And when my sleep is broken, I can't sleep. If I can't sleep, then I feel bad on the day. Why do I sleep on the floor? The floor doesn't move, though it's hard, but now I'm used to it. Therefore, I prefer to sleep on the floor. Now moving on to the living spaces and policy enclosure for the domestic workers. And here we turn to home space, because the migrant domestic workers are all live-in domestic workers. In Singapore, 80% of the population live in public housing flats, these as illustrated in the picture. And in these public housing flats, there's no separate space, no separate room to accommodate the live-in domestic worker. The 20% of Singaporeans who live in private housing, and these would be condominium apartments and houses, there's usually a maid's room, but these maid's room can range from a small windowless space to an ensuite room. So the conditions can vary quite a bit, but for 80% of Singaporeans living in public housing, there's no separate space that caters to the so-called maid. So these foreign domestic workers then inhabit living quarters in close proximity with their employers, and their employers' homes are also their workspaces. So there is a blurring of home and work. And so in spatial terms, and written about this, that these domestic workers learn very quickly to avoid or even to become invisible in the front stage whenever the activities of their employers and their guests, and then to retreat to the backstage, such as the kitchen, in order to try to reclaim some level of privacy, since many of them do not have a room of their own. So it's not just a confinement to the home space, but also to do with the unwritten and written rules around the estate spaces. For those living in condominiums, they are under the watchful gaze of neighbors and security guards. For example, if you are living in a condominium with a swimming pool, the domestic worker is allowed to, in a sense, supervise the child when the child is having swimming lessons, right? But she herself cannot, in a sense, go and swim in the swimming pool on her time off. So to conclude this section, I just want to reflect a little bit about the differential spatial politics of enclosure by looking at how that's applied to male construction workers and female domestic workers. So for the male construction workers, my conclusion here is that enclosure facilitates both care as well as secures compliance by segregating and distancing migrant spaces and keeping the migrant spaces, bodies out of sight and under surveillance, especially when they're not at labor. So the idea here is that the construction workers are sort of like have their place when they're at labor in the construction sites or on the road sites. But when they are at leisure, the idea is that they should be, in a sense, kept apart from the social spaces of citizens. For female domestic workers, spatial proximity is unavoidable, given that they live with their employers in enclosed home spaces and in gated estates. Control here is effected through spatial and temporal strategies of confinement to domestic spaces, as well as a close scrutiny of individual behavior to ensure self-compliance on the part of domestic workers, that they, in a sense, comply with the unwritten expectations of when they are in place and when they are out of place. I will now move on to look at enclavization. And here I want to look at the limits to enclavization in terms of migrant social spaces. So I've already mentioned the term weekend enclaves. This describes the kinds of gathering grounds when migrant workers meet up with fellow migrants to create this space that is a home outside of their home country. And these tend to be core national spaces. The Filipinos gather in Little Manila. Lucky Plaza is a good example. And the South Asians, Bangladeshi, and Indian workers gather in Little India, and so on and so forth. There's also Little Myanmar and gathering spaces for Indonesian workers, for example. So here they are able to socialize with their friends, contact family and friends, send remittances, do other kinds of errands on their rest days. And these are spaces with very different rhythm from the structured timetables, constrained mobility, and surveillance of the work week, right? Okay, so, from the Singaporean public point of view, often these spaces are seen as intrusions into their own backyard and seen quite negatively. And time and again, we hear people asking for these, for the authorities to step up security measures or to relocate the workers to out-of-sight locations. You see there in the pictures, one of the posters that says no littering is quite common in Singapore. But this one is quite special because it's not just no littering, it's also no sleeping, no eating, and no urinating. And it's in different languages to cater to migrant workers. So you know that these posters are directed at migrant workers. So, well, of course, very little effect. I took this picture of the poster, and there are two migrant workers sleeping directly under the poster. So yeah, so these may not have the so-called intended effect. So in that sense, the migrant workers here are very aware of the negative sentiments against the enclave. So they try very hard to project themselves as self-disciplined migrants rather than unruly objects of discrimination. So Mishkat says that, and Mishkat is Bangladeshi, and he talks about how Bangladeshis are very good migrants, and it's the other migrants that are, in a sense, not so self-disciplined. So he says, see, all people are not saints. Some people come here, they gossip, they walk around, but I don't have that intention. I never faced such discrimination with the Singaporeans. And you know, we Bangladeshis are different from others. We try to maintain neat and clean, good dress, and walk with good people. We act gently, we work decently, we are clean shaven, dress up smartly, so that when I go out, Singaporeans don't feel that I'm a worker here. Unlike the Indians, the Burmese, they are not clean. Tamils are different too. And then he suddenly realized that he maybe have gone a bit too far. So he says, actually, I should not talk about this. It's personal matter for that. And he laughs. Yep. So there's this sense of trying to, very hard to, in a sense, present the self as a self-disciplined, productive migrant worker, not someone who is involved in riots and the unruly. This work has been done before the pandemic, and I could talk about the situation of the impact of the pandemic on migrant workers, but let me just confine myself to 2 points here, given the time. So here, I think the 2 points I want to make is that it's kind of paradoxical when the pandemic hit, that whilst it's the so-called unmanaged weekend enclaves, the gathering spaces, where there are large numbers of migrant workers every weekend, whilst these are the spaces that are frowned upon as vectors of disease, it is actually the confinement of these workers to enclosures that eventually and ironically led to the rapid spread of the disease within the dormitories. So in Singapore in 2020, in April, May, June, July 2020, that's when we saw soaring numbers of COVID cases in Singapore. Very, very few in the community, but the large majority was borne by the migrant workers living in dormitories. So over 90% of the cases happened with dormitory workers. The only silver lining I can say is that because these tend to be young men who are healthy, and they wouldn't be in Singapore working if they were not. So there was hardly any deaths. So all of them recovered, were either asymptomatic or recovered. This was before vaccines, right? And throughout 2020, there was only one death amongst migrant workers, a Chinese migrant worker who has been in Singapore for many years, right? So that's the silver lining, but the ironical thing that I want to point out here is that it's confinement and closed spaces that in a sense led to the spread of the virus. The second point I wanted to make is that during the pandemic, the impacts on migrant workers is very severe. There was definitely stricter confinement and segregation of migrant workers in dormitories from the general public, and I could talk about that as well. And for domestic workers, they were not encouraged to take their day off or to go to so-called crowded places during their day off. So in that sense, enclosure tightened during the period of the pandemic. So I come to a conclusion in this final slide. And I just want to reflect, first of all, on enclavization and enclosure, the two conceptual terms that I've been, in a sense, working with. That for enclavization on the part of the low-wage migrants, this tends to denote, this symbolizes intolerable difference and is seen to be a threat to urban security, and more so during the pandemic. Whilst enclosure facilitates effective surveillance of migrant bodies, restricts migrant mobility in the city, and ensures the separation of migrant and citizen spaces. So in the context, and remember that these, in a sense, have to be understood in the context of temporary migration regime, where there are very few safeguards against the loss of jobs and the threat of repatriation. So migrant workers have to, in a sense, fashion themselves as worthy and productive migrants, and very keenly aware of their own temporariness, very, very much aware of the vigilance with which they need to navigate these spaces, because there's always the threat of being out of a job and being returned home. So in that sense, they also become complicit in navigating the spatial politics of enclosure and enclavization under a temporary migration regime. So with that, I thank you for your attention. So thank you very much for listening to me.